I'm Rose Oronje. I am a development expert. I like to call myself that, with a background in science communication and political science. Yes, it's been a very exciting 10 years. I joined AFIDEP on 1st of August in 2013. I had just completed my PhD at that time, and my PhD had looked at the role of evidence in the decision-making, the policy-making space. And of course, as part of that, I had a lot of ideas in terms of what we could do to enhance or increase the use or consideration of evidence in policy-making. But of course, I was very much aware as well that evidence has to interact with a lot of things, because the policy-making space is very political, very interest-driven. And so evidence has to interact and compete with so many things. And so joining AFIDEP, I had a lot of ideas of what we need to do to enhance the role of evidence within the very political decision-making space. And so I had the opportunity to join another institution, another research institution, but I opted for AFIDEP because AFIDEP was at that point just 3 years old, but also the focus of AFIDEP on generally looking at development policy and how you make evidence matter in decision-making was very attractive to me. And so I opted to join AFIDEP because for me it was like a clean slate, a place where I would conceptualize ideas, come up with fundable ideas, implement these, draw lessons, and contribute to development progress in Africa. I am very passionate about evidence and data making a difference in people's lives. So all my life, even before AFIDEP, I've been asking myself and asking researchers that I work with, so what? You are doing all this great research. Whose life is it changing? And so joining AFIDEP 10 years ago, I saw it as the biggest opportunity of my life to put some of the ideas I have into play and convince funders to put in money, and we implement that work and see what happens. And so looking back, I think it's been very, very enlightening and enriching, career-wise very enriching, but looking at the space of evidence to policy, very enlightening. I've had opportunity to work with senior people in government, in ministries of health, senior people in parliaments, testing some interventions that haven't been implemented anywhere, trying to see what really works when it comes to supporting people who sit in government agencies to use evidence. That has been very, very enlightening in the sense that we provided lessons, groundbreaking lessons around things you can do with policymakers for them to use evidence. Ideas around strengthening their capacity and, capacity in evidence synthesis, evidence appraisal and uptake, but also looking beyond just technical skills to look at the institutions. What do they need to do within the institutions to enhance their use of data and evidence in decision making? And so we've had opportunities to work with policymakers in ministries of health and parliaments to develop guidelines for evidence use, develop evidence checklists. For some parliaments, we've even supported the development of manuals around budget analysis, budget tracking, conducting legislative research, all things that there isn't a lot of scholarship around how that works. And so our work has actually been providing the thought leadership and lessons on how you can support policymakers for them to prioritize evidence, but also actually use it. And so for me, being at the center of this work for the last 10 years, it's really been an important career growth because, as I said, I came in with a lot of ideas, a lot of questions. I've had a chance to test this, convince donors that these ideas we need to fund, and even shift how donors think about funding evidence to policy, Maybe before 10 years ago, a lot of donors were focusing on just funding research and thinking about dissemination. But 10 years later, there are donors who are keen to just fund translation, capacity development for evidence use, translation, activities for evidence use, which are some of the things maybe 10 years ago you wouldn't get funders keen on funding that. But our work has shown them that you can actually fund this and make a difference in decision making. And so the 10 years have been really enriching. lots of career growth. Of course, at AFIDEP, I've transitioned. I joined as a policy and communication specialist 10 years ago. Over the years, because of the leadership I've demonstrated, conceptualization of new work, bringing in new funds, I've been able to grow into a director for a program of work on governance and accountability, but also grow into a role to lead the AFIDEP work in Kenya and East Africa. So when I look back, it's been worth it, you know, being part of this journey. Yeah. Some of the groundbreaking work I've implemented has been around strengthening capacity for evidence use. And within that, we've done many things. One of the publications that we've shared out of this work is one that was published, I think, in 2018, that looked at capacity development for evidence use within government agencies. How does that look like? And what we were sharing there were really the lessons out of this work, work that we had been implementing in Kenya, Malawi, in ministries of health and in parliaments, and really looking at what works when it comes to capacity development. And so our work demonstrated that you can strengthen capacity through training and mentorship of civil servants and actually get them to practice, you know, the things they learn from the workshops. Because we trained civil servants over a very intense 1 week, and then we mentored them for 12 months. And during those 12 months, they found evidence, assessed its quality, synthesized it, produced policy briefs, and some of them actually had that evidence used in developing strategies, you know. And so we're sharing lessons out of that, that you can actually do. This is a workable intervention that you can train and mentor, you know, people who sit in government agencies to use evidence. But of course, an important thing was that training and mentorship needs to go hand in hand with strengthening institutional capacity. So that was one of the big things coming out of that publication, because we had strengthening institutional capacity is often complex, and we hadn't implemented a lot of activities around strengthening institutional capacity. And we realized that, yes, people can have skills and be able to apply evidence, but as long as they're working in contexts where they don't have funds, you know, to even do some of the things they want to do, they're working in contexts where they don't have tools that can be put in routine decision-making processes, then they may not be able to apply their skills. And so demonstrating that training and mentorship works, but we also need to do that at the same time we need to strengthen institutional structures, you know, for evidence use. And actually out of that work and that paper, we got more funding from different funders to now implement work that focused on just strengthening structures for evidence use within ministries of health in various countries. Many lessons, I would say, but I'll only flag a few. One of them is the value of partnerships and relationships with government agencies, with parliaments, particularly for our work at AFIDEP, and the work I've been leading has really focused on enhancing evidence use. So focusing on who's using this evidence. Our main focus has been people who sit in the bureaucracies, in governments. And so developing mutual, sustained partnerships have been critical. And those are things that, you know, the things that we must take forward as AFIDEP. That evidence use does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a space where people believe you value their work, you understand the policy processes, the politics, and that you are willing to work with them hand in hand. You're not just here to implement a project and move on, you know. And so those supportive relationships sustained over time has been a key thing. The other lesson has really been about longer term efforts. And this is big, and it's something I keep highlighting, especially to funding agencies, because, you know, I mean, as AFIDEP, we are donor funded. And so we get grants, you know, 2-year grants, 3-year grants. But when you look at evidence use and our drive has been really to focus on nurturing a culture of evidence use. That needs much longer time. It needs funding that is beyond 2 years, because you're building relationships, you're helping people change the way they work, the way they make decisions. And so thinking about work on evidence use and supporting that and strengthening the capacities and just building that culture has to be a longer term investment. And that's one of the reasons I think I really prioritized joining AFIDEP, because AFIDEP, that's what AFIDEP was focused on. And AFIDEP was not a project, it was an institution that was going to be there in the long run, supporting governments, come to a point where they're looking at data, evidence in their day-to-day decisions, not just when they are doing longer term, strategies like Vision 2030. So taking a longer term view is really critical if you're thinking of getting to a point where data and evidence use is a norm, is something that we do every day and not something that we do once in a while. One thing that is interesting for me as I look into maybe the next 10 years at AFIDEP is to think about the role of communities and citizens in the evidence space. Much of the work I've led at AFIDEP has really been at the decision maker level, the leadership level. But I believe that leaders need to be accountable to citizens. And one of the ways in which we can strengthen or enhance citizen power, in holding their leaders to account, is having citizens talk from a data and evidence point of view. A citizen who has evidence and data on what their leaders are doing is better placed to hold their leader to account than one who doesn't have that data and evidence. And so for me, looking into the future, be it at AFIDEP or elsewhere, is really thinking about how do we bring citizens at the center of data and evidence use, so that yes, institutions like AFIDEP and researchers and funders do their work in supporting decision making, but also citizens who are the ones paying salaries of leaders and politicians are actually using data and evidence to hold their leaders to account. So kind of a movement around bringing citizens to the center of the evidence to policy decision making field. Yeah.